Parenting Desire, a podcast series on how to circumvent desire rivaling by Nicholas Sakellariou. Episode 6, coming full circle to impersonal tone. What if desire, previously interpreted sensationally to indicate a passion contradicting an insight, parochially made sense no more? What if sense-making, proximately regarded an instrument bringing physical reference to those in search for insight confirming belief, brought a remark no less? By God, as a result of both remarking an outcome of search and interpreting longing in favor of seeing with one's eyes, comes a sense of having guilt for feeling passionate. Contriving to learn beyond blaming crave for what it dictates, you justify a canon in approaching belief like praise of the senses. I am talking about belief to describe an approach to certainty with reference to indulging whatever desire. In addition, the priority indicated by believing is exactly what desire rivaling will show. No one sound may feel prioritizing where there is someone confusing a desire as directing attention to places where learning is about what one can read. In exaggerating desire intolerance, behavioral moderation lessens impulse personal blaming to whoever attends satisfaction about body seduction. In theory, prioritizing sensational abstinence bypasses enduring confusion. In practice, undoing the temporary esoteric intolerance is setting the perpetual tribute to exchange parochial literature with evidence observing. Concluding the last episode where I focused on the two most unrecognized grand pillars of Western transcendentalism, epic ballads attributed to the legendary lyricist Homer, the suggestion I offered was that when someone makes an effort in self-care, they too face immense aggression over receiving the requisite benefits. Overcoming a period of feeling that rather than making steps forward you have begun to stagnate, I said depends on promoting the same transcendental provisions about time seen in Homer's prose. To care for oneself means an individual prioritizes fervor's zest over plain restriction indefinitely. By experience, this confidence-building era begins for them gradually the very moment they compare who others expect them to be with who they admire. The last episode surmised that commencing so a search has plenty of staggering repercussions. Once committed to do whatever they crave, another, even more demanding period begins. Subsequently, I gave anyone who found themselves sensing their longing adapts to their impatience a technique to overcome that sensation. Coming of age, a metaphor I borrow from the Homeric tales, was used to associate a person's readiness to proceed to the next stage of their training with being conscious they have arrived this condition. I hence recognized in my previous communication that unless anger was addressed, all the more wanting the challenge continues. Standing your ground, which I have spoken about extensively in several occasions, does create distress, the source of which trainees of this method have identified to be the mismatch of their long-held crave as opposed to their everyday contriving for it. I have said in different expressions that the prerequisite to undo crave battling, which this methodology stands for, is to address the discrepancy between rejecting and attaining a pleasure. A person who adopts the latter pursues nothing short of appreciating their condition with time. The argument of the previous episode said nobody who pursues impatiently an outcome based on personal effort is capable of sustaining that trial. Rather than having numerous periods in one's search taking such toll, my proposition was made with respect to acknowledging a time that releasing fury, stigmatized on the prose of many, has behavioral implications which turn that individual's growth more visible and attending an episode in their development more reassuring. Often gone missing or thought insignificant, the effect that impatience brings to a parent of desire is that it inhibits constructing tolerance for others' endeavors. I mentioned those who endure self-improvement preparation prior to reaching this reassuring season necessarily have encountered personal turmoil. What is more, they enter that demanding, anger-marked place in multiple stages making up their progress. Not knowing when a taxing season ends exacerbates longing to the extent that time marks unfulfilled steps. Rarely does prioritizing satisfaction receive such praise, given that self-indulgence does not suggest the topic of significance in control-advocating commentaries. In fact, theories have often procured anger management for those expressing their frustration without constraint. Hence, my undoing desire rivaling method, apart from indulging an impatient correspondent's determination to proceed with achieving as quickly as possible satisfying results, also promotes a technique to endure that commitment. Odysseus and his crew, by the standard narrative, endured plenty difficult episodes assumed to culminate reaching some end, for which most have attached several completion-revealing names such as refuge or life's purpose. Nevertheless, my interpretation of Homer's poems has been one emphasizing not whatever impediments seekers on this episodes face, adversaries in their competitive self-discovery odyssey. I have instead meant to offer a view which premises a season of preparation lasting from when someone recognizes they undergo dramatic episode attendance to that seeker accomplishing self-care by making themselves a protagonist. Caring, my self-centered training addresses from having its participants respond to all difficulties arising upon advancing confidence with the same acknowledgement, which I termed readiness. Pretending they have reached serenity despite an attitude that condemns pleasure, an affiliate of control has taken neither their time to undo crave battling nor the care one shows at making esteem anybody's priority. I called attention to escapism, somebody avoiding being desireful, and contrasted its distress with the exuberant journey to finding whatever situation esteem augmenting. It is my effort in this podcast to bring about self-care that begins with feeling passionate. Regarding the completion of a stage that one passes during their upbringing, I said evidence is gathered by those who apply experiment logic to measuring care, sensed as the absence of all ends but bravery. A phrase telling of that bravery realizing condition, coming of age, denotes that somebody has endured a long season where training, even though it appears to be happening solely when the trainee practices some designated exercise, covers everything taking place before them. My all-encompassing empiricist goal regarding seeing with one's eyes since the beginning of sharing parenting desire with seekers of personal growth articulated not a philosophy but common sense about believing, by which parenting stood for indulging whatever was craved inasmuch as the crave-sensing seeker could distinguish between evidence of confidence and signs of distress. My method consists of 7 techniques, from which 4 were discussed throughout previous tunings of parenting desire. In practice, an individual did not carry former assumptions to increase their self-esteem, let alone control it. Instead, pursuing self-care became about anybody upon whom this method can establish a theory-free finding. All 5 episodes introduced thus far pertain to a methodology whose purpose is to reduce torment resulting from behavioral pretentiousness. In episode 5, for instance, I revisited a time once tormenting was the result of self-blaming, which is also the reason for losing track of their decisiveness. Pardoning, bearing semblance to the idea which a rival of desire has, alleging exuberance as an aberration, does not belong in a series about bravery. Therefrom, to reduce blaming, my methodology proposed a verbalization exercise whose repeated training has the effect a self-care pursuer captures by coming of age. This episode takes on techniques described in the series and it analyzes them from the point of view of anatomy and physical chemistry. As capitulation of each technique's purpose, I also connect my analysis with the 3 principles of scientific experimentation: universality, replicability, and measurement. The technique bearing the name Nauli, a breathing sequence I detailed to help parents of desire reduce self-doubt, is from a physical-chemical standpoint an expansion of the artery that connects the heart with the carotid due to carbon molecules passing through the throat being subject to combustion. Pleasure, recognized from the same perspective, makes up an increase in carbon molecules that travel from the stomach, where they are made from anaerobic conditions, breaking down peptides and carbohydrates inside glands, through breathing to the throat. Making these molecules with faster than customary speed occurs when the stomach has very little acidic gas that descends from the glands which do not carry toxins. The definition of agony as it affects biochemistry is a toxin formation resulting separation in glands because an agonizing individual produces fewer saliva. This prevents their stomach from making enough gastric hormones such as those responsible for secreting carbon molecules from digestion. One whose agony reaches severe states is no longer capable of keeping their digestive enzymes within normal production levels, which causes their blood cholesterol to collapse, eventually lowering such body's metabolism. The Nauli technique builds a person's capacity to open themselves for sensing with satisfaction by promoting a metabolic response that minimizes agony. What causes someone to doubt themselves, pleasure deprivation, is chemically understood from putting more pressure on the organs that carry blood to feed their anatomy. The said pressure, exerted on the heart and liver, is a result of three substances being provided with less than capacitated stream: endorphins, blood, and carbon molecules. Biochemically, doubt brings the pituitary gland and hypothalamus, where endorphin production is taking place at instances of arousal, to a halt. First, while having agony caused by dissatisfaction that physiologically keeps glands separated, the artery which fuels with cells one's brain, located underneath the carotid, stalls, hence creating endorphins necessarily requires longer than usual. Second, by prolonging endorphin output, the agony someone experiences augments because their parasympathetic nervous system collapses also. Their low blood cholesterol causes their lymphatic organs to open less every time such person denies satisfaction. Third, while agony persists, it is anatomically speaking far from tangible to connect glands to other parts across every denier's anatomy whose lymphatic component does not produce blood having pressure that directs their heart without compromising it. To counteract being pressured, veins around the heart as well as on top of it shrink. That entails lack of oxygen along anyone's anatomy. To alleviate their parasympathetic organs from more shrinkage, an affected bloodstream is distributing such oxygen with less than usual stream that is happening concurrently with diminished pumping carried by a horizontal artery across lymphatic tissue connecting the heart with the liver. Two separate functions taking place within the vicinity of the stomach, its esophagus found at its entrance and spleen residing below it, consist in feeding the artery that connects the heart and the liver with blood. First, the esophagus has a valve that opens to receive blood from upstream to carry along the veins of the heart, and second, while carrying this density to its destination, those veins join with stream coming from below, where the artery which takes blood along somebody's lymphatic organs starts to feed the liver. By feeding its lymphatic side with such stream, every round of Nauli taken has the effect of making deeper that connection between veins joining to supply those organs and molecules with organic compound bonds traveling across the pharynx of an individual. A person who practices such breathing sequence intensifies that blood delivery due to the rhinal fissure opening to receive carbon released by cells that ascend from the throat, being pushed continuously upwards, while oxygen atoms generate bonds with atmospheric pressure ingredients above the carotid. This, in biochemical analysis, is the outcome of a normal inhale from the mouth, the initial step of the Nauli breathing, whereas the outcome of exhaling through the nose without speeding it, being the second step, makes for having less oxygen entering a pharynx, which entails less than usual amount of molecular carbon inside one's lungs. What physiologically causes anybody who prolongs the respiratory cycle through holding an inhalation from the mouth normally and slowly letting air come from the nose, a heartbeat on reduced palm suggests culmination of lowering the amount distributed to such like person's esophagus of carbonized, high inorganic molecules cells. The third step of the Nauli, restraining one's breath on the count of their capacity, produces a reaction from their lungs, an osmosis of tissue on their both sides that makes a trainee's diaphragm to seal, which then results in fewer atoms moving between carotid and esophagus. The universality, therefore, of this technique comes from all who apply it having the same reaction to air streamed from the mouth and kept for a few seconds at the top of the exhalation from the nose. Lowering the heartbeat is the reason holding the breath ensues as part of the sequence, given that whilst the heart pumps less, the oxygen carried from the lungs towards that person's carotid is not causing an excess of shared by covalent bonds electrons entering their pharynx. The next two steps of the Nauli, inhaling from the nose and immediately exhaling from the mouth, have whoever attends such training further lowering of the blood pressure at veins that cross the body's parasympathetic tissue. By conducting one Nauli, in sum, the trainee brings a diminished cellular load on both parasympathetic and sympathetic organs through their renal artery of crossing perpendicularly low abdominal aorta, minimizing so how much carbon is held by the stomach. For that common reaction, a person's esteem, their ability to conduct passionate attitude, is associated with minimizing carbon molecules passing the pharynx where they combust due to oxygen incoming by air having less molecular pressure by which they react. For that reason, as fewer molecules are entering that pharynx, its low carbon content makes agony to lessen, pushing back fewer hydrogen electrons to the esophagus. The more anybody is applying this breathing exercise, the less hydrogen electrons are entering their esophagus via their pharynx, which produces a surplus, not a shortage, of neutrons inside their stomach. It is by not compressing fervor that a person addresses agony. Rather, agony diminishes as a result of fewer carbon molecules that have ascended to the level above carotid, bonding with oxygen inside the pharynx. Therefore, with slowing down muscular pumping around the heart area, toning of the artery that connects a Nauli applicant's heart with their liver was correspondingly made possible thermodynamically from a stimulation of their carotid, which suddenly moves because of electric ignition sparked the moment they breathe out from the nose due to atom separation of carbon molecules. Both expressions of holding someone's respiratory sequence by either counting internally from 1 to 6 or visualizing numbers create the same carotid response. Therefore, a Nauli practice depends on minimizing the occurrence of oxygen bonds within their throat. The combination of negatively charged electrons being formed at such minimized rate on top of the esophagus and thermal arrest of carbon above carotid is producing lower stream on a trainee's heart and spleen by bringing them not the blood surplus which an agonizer produces, but a satisfactory flow. It is this carotid movement, initiated as multiple bonds between oxygen molecules are subject to combustion within the pharynx due to carbon molecules that ascend from the throat, which entails lessening somebody's agony. Through prolonging that carotid stimulation, the person who trains this exercise has both their esophagus and spleen react to lower amount of blood by adjusting valve and renal artery therein, which correspondingly open up, letting tissue position itself above the stomach, thus reducing how many electrons leave from inside. It is not to be confused with the bowel stretching motion aimed at strengthening somebody's lower abdominal tissue as it targets somebody's esophagus. I will, as a consequence, differentiate between that motion and my methodology. The universality of the Nauli, by which I'm referring to the technique's function, those common to all esophagus and spleen biological characteristics, can be so illustrated jointly with the technique's measurement, how the body physiologically adjusts to self-imposed reduction of cardiac rhythm. Replicability as regards this function is a matter of restoring one's satisfaction compared to previous cardiac capacity, which in biological sense means increasing the amount of electrons passing through the esophagus, which depends on reducing how much oxygen be held along an artery pumping blood from somebody's heart. The 5 components that comprise this sequence, an inhalation from the mouth, an exhalation from the nose to then pause for some time, and the opposite of steps 1 and 2 conducted reversely, suggest a fervor-generating biochemical processing by the stomach of carbon electrons which are inside it. A trainee who regularly minimizes these electrons' number prevents their ascent toward this person's pharynx, making thus every artery which connects the carotid with the digestive organs wider, entailing lower number of molecular oxygen throughout that anatomy. This continuous lessening of oxygen-carrying veins along parasympathetic organs has anybody lessen their agony due to closing of those veins' access to blood that has cholesterol shortage, leading heretofore metabolism to grow. The next technique in the series follows the same organs supporting self-esteem, which also make a person's adrenaline levels fit for living courageously. I introduced it by telling a story of finding self-care with two protagonists, a boy and a girl that live on an island around a volcano. I detailed the technique's steps the moment of my narrative where the protagonists pursue a lion, taking them both to a walk alongside that crater's periphery, initiating so the recovery of a heartwarming memory. Undoing desire rivaling happens biologically when no congestion of carbon electrons pressured upwards from veins traveling somebody's heart and liver is formed at passionate moments within one's esophagus. Hence, said two organs are the definition of having an empowering anatomy. These anatomical parts of crave fostering are related due to an individual's digestive arteries that connect veins which surround the stomach, forming one cyclic vein which has its one end at the liver and the other at their esophagus. Standing close to each other, the heart above and to the upper left side of someone's parasympathetic tissue form an extension of living passionately. Hence, by means of biochemically communicating to someone how to approach blending praise and prose of desire, the Rolling Stone is a follow-up to the previous discussion. Next to reducing dissatisfaction after promoting the Nauli, I continue with another sequence aimed at orienting towards a goal which does match an individual's renal artery's ability to carry blood without exerting pressure on their sympathetic expression. In fact, from a tribute to self-praise point of view, I refer to it as Rolling Stone, given its direct reference to the indulgence asserting poetry featuring that same rhythm. What is more, referencing includes Sympathy for the Devil, a song I entitled a chapter of my book after to talk about ego, as well as You Can't Always Get What You Want, to further that praise. Biologically speaking, the sympathetic nervous system has lost its capacity to undo desire rivaling while there's no attending of its toxins from the liver and spleen. In such sense, the rolling adjective praises the heart's will, while stone is a metaphor for the ability a trainee acquires to chemically reduce how much toxifying waste, which is the result of them pressing themselves to deny what they want, circulates the renal artery. Such diminishing of toxins by somebody's liver and spleen, this technique makes possible through aligning these organs' tissue with renal artery orientation. It hence enables said artery to conduct flow as opposed to provide an imposter's sympathetic veins the distribution contour to cut across their reach. The Rolling Stone, therefore, does augment how much blood carried by an imposter's renal artery reaches their liver. Hence, through training it, the individual's biochemistry undergoes modification caused by a pressure diminishment on their parasympathetic tissue. While distributing a new blood throughout their veins, toxifying damage, resulting from stale cells that break open from cytosis, is prevented by diminishing to how many electrons pass through one's throat, which affects their renal artery. Someone who's bringing about fewer stale cells to their esophagus, as having repeatedly carried through that artery a stream of reduced toxicity, is able to make an effort to undo desire rivaling. In that regard, every effort to stabilize a person's courage has to start with realizing which desire makes them enthusiastic and which does not. By its replicability, a technique fueling enthusiasm feeds the heart, aligning so the veins crossing one's sternum with their esophagus. Such alignment is a result of pushing no more tissue towards one's stomach, being itself the outcome of adjusting cardiac rhythm to match the tension of having fewer blood oxygenated by the lungs. The universality and measurement of this sequence are closely bound to each other, therefore I analyze all three concurrently. Steps 1 and 2 of the Rolling Stone can be given on as preparation for this training's execution. Standing or seated an individual starts because there is no relationship between lowering toxin distribution from that trainee's liver and how the spine is erected. Sympathy for being enthusiastic is promoted in step 2 by concentrating on a memory that makes a person proud of themselves. From a biochemistry point of view, a twofold response is initiated. The membrane which covers their cerebral tissue, due to endorphins released from that person's hypothalamus, enlarges, which causes a lessening of the pressure on their parasympathetic organs stemming from condoning an appetite. Besides, the generation of an affirmative of pride memory, causing synapses which form the frontal lobe to be more fast-moving versus a slower response to dissatisfying recall, sends the lymphatic organs a signal which produces temperature increase in the heart area. The third step of the Rolling Stone, the visualization of a beam around the heart which emanates a blue-yellow light as it moves cyclically around its periphery, produces, biochemically speaking, lowering of pressure along the aorta. The reason this happens is imagining a movement surrounding the heart sends the brain a kinetic message that results in fueling to the bloodstream fewer oxygen to not overstimulate the lungs. The color of the circle suggested as part of this visualization conveys concentration which is easier to accomplish because ultraviolet has the lowest compared to other colors of the spectrum wavelength, making it seen by keeping the eyeball less stretched. Therefore, such sight is softer to keep visualizing. In the third technique, to be put under the experimental principles comparison, the patience generating syllables, I show how fervor is related to a combustion facilitation taking place in the larynx. After realizing they long for achieving the condition of impartiality, as opposed to pretending they hold such, trainees enter the demanding era of proving they're advancing. I therefore end this episode outlining how someone is able to reduce impatient longing as a result of positioning their tongue on one's roof of the mouth to pronounce a praise about that era. The combination of syllables a, ru, for men and a, ra, for women has biochemical effects which are similar to those previously analyzed in this episode. This sequence's biochemistry regards two main arteries that connect somebody's liver to their parasympathetic organs. The renal, which is located above the spleen, and its counterpart on the left of the body. First, universality of pronouncing applies to all because enzymes released by the spleen as someone experiences anger are common to everybody, hence their effort, entailing reduction of tension along the pancreas, has the same biochemical response from those who extol being patient. The positioning of the tongue when an individual inhales or exhales from the mouth pronouncing ah is the same. It sits on one's mouth base, which keeps only a small diaphragm fraction open. Therefore, the main effect that it produces is lowering oxygen concentration inside one's bloodstream. During pronouncement of ru or ra, positioning of the tongue becomes twirled and subsequently followed by a sudden shake towards its base, one's mouth empties. In effect, combustion in the larynx ensues. As ra is pronounced, the difference that the lips open positioning produces to a person's biochemistry equals a slight lowering of air pressure on their aorta, which is the result of extra fewer oxygen traveling between their heart and liver across both renal arteries. Female bodies, due to their higher cholesterol levels, are prone to having increased tension around the aorta that this technique is designed to reduce. By adding the third syllable of the pronouncement, more air passes through the nose, which entails keeping regular cardiac pulse unfettered by anger. Second, the replicability and measurement of the sequencing are intertwined, given it depends on how soon after a trainee begins to pronounce their patients, they cease to experience unease during a moment of expecting advancement in their self-care. Third, it is by such three cumulative results, combustion within the larynx, lowering of oxygen concentration in the renal arteries, and pulse regulation, that lowering of the pancreatic tension produced by spleen-formed enzymic stream occurs. In this episode, covering 3 techniques of the method which trains someone to undo desire rivaling, I laid out for each of them one explanation regarding why fervor development, that comes with passionate behavior, does depend on biological features promoting that bravery. I specifically argued that the heart, liver, and esophagus are body parts that correspond to a state which, chemically speaking, fuels training to promote exuberant living. I have oftentimes made this point about self-care as biology of desire in this podcast, by which association, called for throughout the entire series, those individuals approaching personal growth from self-condescending standpoints cannot expand the biological counterparts of exuberance. Contrary to theorists that suppose the body prevents them from advancing their status, in practice, with indulging physical satisfaction, I proposed acknowledging one's serenity to be media sensed. I hence stood with having universality, replicability, and measurement define the steps of each experiment in growing exuberance, because what my method premises is an empirical evaluation awaiting to be conducted. Self-control impedes training fervor accumulation because it is impossible for someone to increase chemical absorbance by their parasympathetic organs of hydrogen electrons deriving from combusted molecules while a shortage of neutrons persists between their heart and liver. Besides, an impatient longing, which compresses the muscles of the heart, prevents a person from pumping sufficient blood towards that individual's esophagus, where it has the effect of reducing the number of carbon neutrons within cells entering inside one's throat, making it very unlikely for their carotid to thermodynamically start molecular combustion to every respiratory cycle. To thus feed the artery which connects someone's carotid to their stomach with such sufficiency, it is necessary they prolong holding of oxygen molecules inside both suppliers of blood, which has the effect for anybody who trains the techniques I heretofore analyzed of minimizing agony. This episode's title, coming full circle to impersonal tone, my correspondents, after connecting science of desire and techniques to pursue their advancement, read experientially, recognizing they no longer have agony despite being amidst the time their continuing self-care is not culminating immediate accomplishments, only rest that passing from one effort to the next recommends. An imposter, whoever forces upon themselves any personal conduct, is seeing progress by projecting somebody else's thoughts to themselves, caring less about their own ability to measure achievements. The last episode of my Parenting Desire series will be an analysis of what it means to meditate from the same experimental logic that was adopted by episode 6. To see not as distracted rivals of desire, I will argue in episode 7, theorists of personal progress bring their visual focus to where there is evidence of achieving self-care. Those correspondents of my methodology, presuming meditation to be a way to calm themselves, are given a comparative experiment that concludes it is not. Seeing single-mindedly has an exhilarating rather than tranquilizing outcome. Until then, I respect not just the ones who praise their desires, but also the ones who do not.